Thank you very much, NASA. I have to say, it's fascinating to hear about Dubai's plans for the next 2 decades. I've been here for about 13 years now, and it's been fascinating to see the city and the entire country unfold. And just hearing about the plans, doubling of the green spaces, public transport within 800 metres. I think Dubai is going to be an even better place to live in the years to come. And certainly, I think, the centrepiece of Expo 2020 Dubai has already shown just what can be achieved by the great minds in this country. Thank you very much. Well, our next session today is going to be taking a look at the global economic outlook for the year ahead. Now, the IMF has warned recently that the global economy is bouncing back, but says the pandemic is continuing to limit the recovery. One of the biggest issues is posed by the great vaccination divide that has left too many countries with not enough access to COVID-19 vaccines. Now, the IMF says that a global recovery remains hobbled by the pandemic and its impact. In fact, they've likened it is like walking with stones in our shoes. Well, our next speaker today is Professor Ian Golden. He's a Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. Considered a tour de force in the world of economics, Professor Golden is the founding director of the Oxford Martin School. Now, he's also the former Vice President of the World Bank and served as an advisor to South Africa's first democratically elected president, none other than President Nelson Mandela. Now, this morning he has joined us. He's flown here all the way from the UK, and today he's going to be looking at the economic forces that are filtering through the global economy. He's going to be advising us what to watch out for on the horizon. Now, he's also very graciously accepted a short question and answers at the end of his session. So if you do have any questions, please do let us know. We do have the microphones in the middle of the arena here. Please, everybody, welcome to the stage Professor Ian Golden.
Thank you, Katie. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be here and share thoughts about the future of the world economy and the implications for Dubai and not least the property sector here. I've been coming to Dubai since the 1980s, and it's wonderful to hear in the strategic plan the achievements of the last 60 years, which have been absolutely astounding. There are very few places on earth that have done what Dubai has done, and the UAE. And to hear the vision of the period to 2040, only 19 years away, is inspiring, and I wish the government, Your Excellency, all your colleagues, and the citizens of Dubai my best wishes as you achieve this astounding vision. By 2040, the world economy will look very different. China will be by far the biggest economy in the world, most probably accounting for about 18% of global economic activity. The US would have slipped from number 1 to number 3, accounting for about 12% of economic activity. India will be bigger than the US as well, number 2 at around 15% of global economic activity. And Indonesia will be close behind the US with about 10% of global economic activity. The UK would have slipped out of the top 10, and Europe combined will be about 10%. It's probably smaller than Indonesia. What does this all mean? It means that the center of global economic gravity is shifting fast, and the pandemic, like with so many other things, has accelerated the shift towards this region and further east, South and East Asia. In that, the UAE is ideally placed to be a bridge, to be a center. And not only is where things happening changing and where economic activity, but the composition of economic activity is shifting radically from manufacturing to services, and within services, increasingly to digital, financial, and people services, hospitality, retirement, care, health, education, accounting for a greater and greater share of our economies. Again, that places the UAE and Dubai in an ideal situation, because that is what you're good at. That is the comparative advantage of this region. And more people will come here to enjoy this, with dramatic implications for property and the real estate sector. I'm optimistic. We're already seeing a rebound to the sorts of levels that we saw before the pandemic, and this will be sustained. I will talk about some dark clouds that remain on the horizon. We are not certain about many things, and in fact, uncertainty has grown. In all respects, the pandemic has compressed time. It's allowed what would have taken 10 or longer years to occur to happen in the space of 18 months. People talk about deglobalization and how the pandemic has led to a deglobalized world, but in fact, I think it's done the opposite. It's accelerated globalization. We see this in many, although of course not all, respects. We see it in the soaring of digital connectivity. This impact would have been totally different if it had occurred 15 or 20 years ago, before the World Wide Web and Internet. Commerce and activity has accelerated. But so too have financial flows. We've seen not only in soaring stock markets, in record levels of mergers and acquisitions, in direct foreign investment, not least in China, cross-border flows. And what we will also be seeing is increasing governmental flows and international financial institution flows. Because over 46 countries, not least in sub-Saharan Africa, are severely at the edge of debt crises. So this aspect of globalization, the financial aspect, is likely to be accelerated. We've also seen, of course, a radical change in what we understand governments can do and should do. If people had said to us in January of 2020, you can't do anything, you've got to stay at home, we're locking you down, you can't fly, we would have thought that we lived in a very different world. But we embrace that now for our own health and safety. If governments had issued 10 to 20%, as the OECD economies have done, of stimulus checks, we would have regarded them as extraordinarily risky. But now we accept that that was the right thing to do, that the stimulus of $20 trillion that the rich countries found for themselves, that's about the size of the US economy or the whole European economy. $20 trillion was the appropriate thing to do. Many aspects of globalization have changed in the short term, not least business travel and people travel, and that's why we talk of the K-shaped recovery, with some sectors doing incredibly well and others collapsing, not least hospitality and areas associated with that, tourism, travel, restaurants, people-to-people events. And it's a great pleasure to be at an event like this again, physically together. There is no substitute for physical space. There has been a flight from cities. Indeed, Dubai has benefited, and the Golden Visa Scheme is, I think, a very wise aspect of that, where people can work remotely now, not least professional services. And as professional services distribution grows, as we are able to do things more effectively from greater distance, it raises the question, why should we leave London or New York to go to the suburbs of London or New York when we can just as well do the work from elsewhere and places like Dubai? And so we will see a relocation of professional services that can be done remotely, not least in law, in finance, in architecture, and in many other areas. And increasingly, this is even going to move into areas like health, where, for example, remote consultations, remote robotic surgery, and other types of performances are possible. This is a huge, huge opportunity for Dubai. The question is, what is the implication for cities like New York, London, and others? Will people just flee them? And do they have a future? I'm confident that they do, as younger places, as vibrant creative centers, because cities always have been where people want to be. The economies of agglomeration attract people. And so I'm optimistic that what we will have coming out of this is an acceleration of more flexibility globally, the acceleration of the internationalization of professional services, the acceleration of more flexible work hours, the end of the 9-to-5 commute in places like New York and London. And this is all good news, including, of course, a better balance between work and life becoming what one is passionate about. In the shorter term, we are seeing this year the most extraordinary bounce back. There has never been a period since the Second World War where economies have grown so rapidly, and so many economies have grown so rapidly. Last year, the global economy contracted by about 4%. This year, we anticipate at least an equivalent improvement in the global economy. And the UAE and Dubai is experiencing this too. There were very few economies that didn't contract last year: China, Ireland, and a number of others. The coming year is likely to also be a very strong one. Perhaps not quite as strong as this one, but positive for the world, growing at 3%. But increasingly, the composition of this growth is moving away from Europe towards, as I mentioned in the outset, this region, with China particularly driving, being the engine of global growth, and India, very robust growth too. This is in no small part due to the stimulus. As the stimulus unwinds, a key question is, what will be the implication? Will it slow growth? And that depends entirely on what the stimulus has been spent on. If the stimulus has been spent on consumption, like the stimulus package of the 1920s, 100 years ago, we do risk a consumption-fueled inflationary spiral. But if the stimulus has been spent on investment, on building the foundations for a better future in health, in education, in infrastructure, then we can be optimistic that we are not going to be in that cycle, that we will be in a cycle of sustained growth. And the evidence so far has demonstrated that that is the case. Sustained growth, which is not inflationary, depends on supply chains recovering. We have seen very worrying signs in recent months of inflationary tendencies driven by peaks in energy prices and severe constraints on supplies. There have also been severe constraints on labor markets. We have this paradox in the OECD economies of very high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, averaging over 10%, with shortages of labor. A paradox explained in many respects by people's recalibration of what they want to do. There's what has been called a great resignation from work. People resigning, not wishing to go back, particularly to the sorts of work that they had before, and increasing competition between employers about what sort of workplaces they have. My own view is that this is likely to recalibrate in most economies, except in the UK. The UK has suffered from a twin crisis: the pandemic, which has knocked about 2% of growth, and Brexit, which has knocked about 4% of growth, double the impact of the pandemic. And the labor shortages are particularly acute in the UK as a result of this. The constraints on visas and trade frictions, which risk being escalated by tensions over fishing rights with France, have led to great shortages of truckers, of people in all sorts of industries, and that threatens to make inflation more sticky in the UK than it will be in other places, in Europe, in this region, in China, and in the US. The big question, and the reason why inflation is important, is because if central banks lift interest rates, that will slow the economic recovery. As you know, central banks, particularly independent central banks, are compelled, if inflation remains above about 4%, by their mandates to raise interest rates. What does that mean? Well, in the context of very high levels of debt, and many OECD countries now are approaching 100% of GDP debt, this region, the UAE, is about a third of GDP, much lower levels. But at that level of debt, increases in interest rate mean that a higher share of your expenditures go on service payments. And for developing countries who are generating in local currency and paying debt back in foreign currency, this is particularly worrying. And so we need to avoid steep increases in interest rates. It's inevitable there will be some increase to low levels. We will not be in a very strange territory that we've been the first time ever of negative interest rates on bond and other markets for much longer. We've seen this phenomena, for example, in Germany and even countries like Italy, which we used to regard as very risky, with rates close to zero. We're coming to the end of that, and we should see a normalization of the interest rate cycle in the coming years. As economies recover, as these opportunities become greater, of course, the cost of borrowing will rise, and with that, debt becomes a bigger issue. Consumers will feel less rich in many economies, and of course, another accelerator of the pandemic has been to accelerate inequalities. We've seen inequalities grow within countries and between countries. While some have done incredibly well, as stock markets have soared, particularly in technology, as property prices have gone up very significantly for larger homes, others have lost their jobs. And in countries where there are no safety nets, like in India, in Pakistan, in many countries in Africa, there's been an increase in extreme poverty. The World Bank estimates that 150 million more people have been pushed into extreme poverty by the pandemic. The World Food Programme estimates that an equivalent amount of people have been pushed into extreme hunger. The Sustainable Development Goals, which were unanimously agreed by world leaders, have been totally derailed by this pandemic. And so we live in this world where some are feeling very comfortable and others not. And of course, this is also reflected in the very uneven distribution of vaccines. Less than 6% of Africans have had double vaccinations. The UAE and Dubai has done remarkably well, and Europe is catching up, as is the US. Vaccine hesitancy is a great worry, because mutation of the pandemic would derail this tentative recovery. And so ensuring that the world is vaccinated, ensuring that this recovery can be sustained, that we have very high rates of vaccination throughout the world, and that we keep the booster shots coming is going to be absolutely central to sustained recovery and achieving the ambitions. We also need to use that to be able to exit, particularly for China, which has locked itself out to exit the world. We need an open trading system. We need open travel. We need to return to an integrated world that is essential for everyone, everywhere, and not least for this region. And that will be achieved through high vaccination rates everywhere. The second great disruptor is, of course, the transformation of the world economy over the next 30 years or so to a net zero economy. As has been agreed in Glasgow this past week, this is going to be central to a sustainable planet. This region particularly, and Dubai, knows the implication of dramatic extremes in temperature, of ocean rise, and of the other absolutely predictable outcomes of an increase in carbon emissions. We have passed the point of scientific debate as to if this is happening. We are now into the details. What will the exact impact be? When? And that remains an extraordinarily complex question. But in part, we don't know the answer because we don't know what the response will be, what countries will do, and whether they will achieve what they're saying in Glasgow or go beyond that and stick to a 1.5 average. Averages don't really tell the story. 1.5 doesn't mean 1.5. It means some days might be 5 degrees hotter than normal. It means surges, storms, winds, and other extremes. And that, of course, requires a different sort of cityscape. It requires a cityscape which converts to zero carbon. And at a much more complex level, we also need to think about how we produce concrete and steel without increasing carbon emissions. Net zero also doesn't mean everywhere has to be zero, and there's a huge job to be done in offsets, in closing coal power stations around the world, in India, in Pakistan, in China, in South Africa, in Brazil, and elsewhere as part of this process. And so by 2040, we will be in a very different world. We'll be in a clean world. We'll be in a world where much less pollution happens, but a world where we become resilient to this. The journey there is the uncertainty, how we get there, and whether we are able to. And that will also shape the competitiveness of countries like the UAE, and of course, it will determine what people can do in the future. So if the first great uncertainty is the pandemic, the second, climate change, the third is global geopolitical tensions. There is no global problem, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change or others, which can be solved without the US and China cooperating. The rising geopolitical tensions, particularly between the US and China, are, for me, the greatest uncertainty. This would slow global growth. It would lead to a return to a Cold War. It would mean we cannot solve the pandemic, climate change, cascading financial crises, and other great risks that we face. I never thought I would say this in my lifetime, but I wish that Kissinger were back in the White House. And I say that because he understood how to be tough on China in private and polite and respectful in public. And that is the wisdom that we need, I believe, to avert a new Cold War. The three great uncertainties of the resolution of this pandemic and the stopping of future pandemics, climate change, and the easing of geopolitical tensions will, I believe, provide the backdrop to the UAE's development over the next 30 years. In the short term, they've been largely discounted by markets. In other words, the optimism we're seeing at the moment is taking these into account. And that is good news. So I'm very optimistic about the coming years. I believe that there's an enormous relief. Vaccines do their business. And one of the aspects of globalization we've seen so effective is, of course, the collaboration in science, which allowed these vaccines to be developed. Now we need to ensure that they are distributed globally. What we've learned through this pandemic is how to reappraise what's important in life, in our economies. What we've learned, the importance of science, we've learned the importance of collaboration. We've learned that no country, however mighty, be it China or the US, can go it alone. No wall is high enough to keep out the great risks we face, be they pandemics, be they climate change, or be they other geopolitical and other tensions. But what high walls do keep out is the people, the finance, the goods and services, and the ideas which lead to a thriving economy. The UAE has been a master at managing globalization, at understanding that it brings immense benefits. The progress of the UAE over the last 60 years reflects what globalization can do. The flows across national borders of people, of finance, of ideas, of technologies. But with this comes two risks. And so building resilient societies requires not looking back and celebrating, which we should always do, but also looking forward. And as we think about this year and the next, with a sense of optimism, not least for real estate, the transformation of the real estate sector, the use of high-quality products for high-quality places, for high-quality people, is increasingly going to be the focus of attention. This is, I believe, what the UAE can and will deliver. It's what Dubai has always been good at. And as it reflects on the future, I wish it the very best. And with a great sense of optimism, I believe that this will be the continuing center of what's good about the world and globalization over the coming years. Thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions, if there are.
First, thank you for this speech, a very nice speech. My question is, what do you think of Dubai after Expo? I mean, after this is few years. And do you think there is opportunity to have create Dubai more than this one? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I am extremely optimistic that the plan that we heard before my talk can be realized. What Dubai has always shown is that behind vision, there's real action. Deep reflection leading to investment, which is followed through in a most remarkable way. What seems impossible gets done. And so I am very optimistic about that. I haven't yet had the opportunity, I'm looking forward to that today, to visit Expo. But my sense is that this building out of a new area, and I visited previous expos before in Shanghai and other cities. I've been involved in reflections on how they become places which become vibrant communities, business centers, hospitality centers of the future. And I'm extremely optimistic that this will continue to be the case, that Dubai will keep reinventing itself, will keep moving with the times. The pace of change globally is accelerating, but Dubai has always demonstrated, and I believe will continue to demonstrate, the capacity to keep up with that. And as I indicated in my comments, the global economic center of gravity is moving to over Dubai. So this is, of course, also an extraordinary opportunity for Dubai.
Can I ask you a question, please? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing your insights, in fact. I do have a question about after the pandemic or the next 30 years from today. Is there a foundation that's being built now for a recession-less economy worldwide? And plus, I like the idea when you said about Kissinger being in the White House. But during Kissinger, you know, the tough recessions happened, especially, you know, Arabic and the crisis, you know, petroleum crisis and whatsoever. So in addition to that, would China be number one without any fundamentals? You know, the major foundation of the economy is westernized, as you know, especially after World War II. And forever, America will keep printing bonds and China pumping money in it. So I do believe it might be a musical chair game, but the upper hand would be always for the US economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. You're right to point to the turbulence of not least on the economic front during the Kissinger years. And I was thinking purely of his role in the State Department and the Nixon Kissinger opening up to China and conversations with China. Instability is endemic in the world economy. In other words, we should always inspect instability. Globalization has an underbelly, what I call the butterfly defect of globalization. The more we connect and the richer people are, with more connections, the more we are interdependent. And so what happens elsewhere increasingly affects us, and the spillovers of our actions, like through climate change, increasingly affect the world. And as there are more and more people at higher levels of income, we should expect more instability. At the same time, with higher income comes an ability to have more resilience, more savings, more capacity to bounce back than when we are poor. And that resilience is what is key. Do we have the spare capacity? I've written a lot and thought a lot about just in time and the tensions of fragility that come from not having spare capacity. And my view is that is about people, it's about investment, it's about goods, it's about services, and it's both public and private. We need to understand that we need spare capacity. We need flexibility in systems if they are able to respond. And we also, I think, are recalibrating the role of government. The Thatcher-Reagan revolution, which transformed the world in from the mid-70s, is, I think, the pendulum swinging back. It's been recognized in the pandemic that in the end, we need governments. And governments who are capable, governments who have the capacity financially, in people, and in materials to respond, whether it's a health crisis, a weather crisis, or a financial crisis. And that resilience, I believe, will differentiate those that are able to succeed in the long term from those that not. If a crisis destroys you, then you don't have a long term. There's no long term without short term resilience. And that ability to keep bouncing back will be. So I think it will be a rocky ride. It will be an unstable time in the years ahead. But that shouldn't scare us. It should increase the resolve to build resilience, to have capacity. Because the trend line, although there's uncertainty around it, the trend line, I believe, is extremely positive. And we need to work with that to build the capacity to get to where the society wants. I think we maybe have time for one more question. I don't know about your program, Katie. Okay. The one final question at the back there.
Can I take a question? The question to me, my question is, can you give us a reflection of the digital economy that is going to come and this impact on the globalization and the interrelation of the digital economy with the physical economy, the integration?
Yep. A greater and greater share of the economy is digital, but it's still very small on aggregate. Even in the US, it's less than 10% of economic activity, for example. One big question is why it hasn't led to improvements in productivity. The old paradox of economists is that we see computers everywhere except in higher efficiency and more output. And that is something which is really fundamental. There are many reasons for it, including business catch-up. The digital economy will pervade everything. It will become the nervous system, and it also increases vulnerability, because if there's digital failure, the systems fail across the board. And so cybersecurity, cyber integrity becomes more and more and more important. We don't want people taking money out of our bank accounts or foreign countries, agencies and others, but we also want to make sure that the lights turn on when we touch a pad or whatever in our bedrooms, etc. That integrity remains very vulnerable. The digital economy will facilitate a distribution. It can be energy efficient, but of course it's also very energy consuming. I do not believe we will move to parallel currencies. My own view is that government should, and in the end will, retain monopoly power on currencies. This will give governments at the finest level of every expenditure and understanding of expenditures. It will also, of course, help with crime prevention. But having currencies which are untethered to governments not only mean you cannot control the money supply, but it means, of course, you have parallel economies. So my own view is that the bitcoins of this world, the parallel currencies of this world, are likely increasingly to find themselves marginalized, despite the huge speculative booms that people are enjoying at the moment. At the same time, the blockchain and digital confirming of all contracts will become absolutely pervasive. We will not have paper money, we will not have paper contracts. The blockchain enables this, and it will be extremely significant for logistics, which I believe will increase the efficiencies and the ability to manage and help also with some of the supply chain challenges that we currently face. I'm afraid that's all I have time for, not getting into the next speaker's time. I welcome this opportunity to be here, and I wish you all well through the pandemic and in the years to come. Thank you very much.